communication is just a set of skills. It's a set of skills that anyone can learn. Ask a deep question. Prove you're listening.
Supercommunicators, how to unlock the secret language of connection.
If we approach people with genuine fascination and curiosity, you may be surprised at what happens.
Oftentimes we have to be having the same kind of conversation at the same moment in order to really hear each other. Super communicators are just people who have thought a little bit more deeply about communication.
Can you share more about the 4 rules of a learning conversation?
Your goal in this conversation is simply to understand what the other person is trying to tell you and to speak in such a way that they can understand you. It's something that asks about your values or your beliefs or your experiences. Now, suddenly I'm learning all about this person. I've invited them to tell me who they really are, how they see the world. That's the basis for a real connection.
Charles, it's awesome to have you back on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I was reading Supercommunicators, and there's a small part about your dad, and he died a few years ago, and you wrote a little bit about what he meant to you, but I'm curious, what was your dad like?
It's a good question, right? Because one of the things that I found after my dad passed away was that nobody ever asked me that, right? I would come back from the funeral and I would tell people that I had just been at it. And of course, that's all I was thinking about. And no one would everyone would always say, my condolences and then move on to something else. And so thank you for asking. He was great. He was a lawyer and he was just wonderful.
How did his life and the way he raised you influence you as now an adult and a dad?
Oh, I think about him a lot. I mean, I think probably all fathers think about their own father as they're raising kids, right? And trying to figure out what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. And, there's a lot of things that he pushed me to do, to take risks that I try and push my own kids to do. So it's really nice.
How did he impact you when it came to your educational choices? You're a very educated person, went to schools that were very hard to get into. I'm curious how those conversations went when you were deciding Yale, Harvard, all of that.
Oh, he wasn't into it.
Really?
He thought I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he thought I should go to the University of New Mexico. Yeah, he was older. I mean, he was born in 1929. And so I think for his generation, these distinctions in universities weren't really huge, right? Like for him, it was like, get a degree. The degree is the important part. If you have to spend a lot of money doing it, I'm not certain that it adds that much value. But I think that's also just a reflection of the fact that he hadn't been exposed to what that can add to. And I loved going to Yale and then I went to Harvard for business school. And I really value those opportunities. But I think for him, he thought it was cool, but not like something that was like a big deal.
I was also curious to learn more about the fact that you work for the LA Times and you reported from Iraq about the American military operations. How did that experience shape you?
It was really interesting. I mean, one of the reasons I became a journalist is because I wanted to be a war correspondent, because I thought it would just be interesting and important and very mission oriented. The only real check on the American military when it's in a battlefield is the journalists who are reporting back to citizens of what the military is doing on their behalf. And I had spent time in the Middle East. My wife grew up in Saudi Arabia. We used to live in Egypt. I speak Arabic poorly. And so I really wanted to go and understand what was happening. And it was really interesting. It was a fascinating experience.
Scary?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, scary and frankly, ultimately very selfish. I think that oftentimes when you place yourself in danger, you're not thinking of the people that you're leaving behind and leaving at home. And so I felt that after a little while, I felt that I was doing an unfair thing to my wife and to my family. I didn't have kids at that point.
You mean upon reflection of it, or like you're on the front lines reporting thinking, what am I doing? I'm being a selfish idiot.
Yeah. I mean, not so much the front lines as much as like the plane home. Right.
Yeah.
When you sort of have some time to think. But yeah, it was pretty clear to me pretty early on that there's definitely a selfish element of wanting to be in a war zone.
Okay. I have to also go back to an earlier time in your life. There was a terrifying day in 1999 and you decided to be a bike messenger in San Francisco. What happened on that one day?
So this is before I went to business school. I started a company back in New Mexico, and before business school, my now wife, then girlfriend, was going to grad school up at Berkeley, and so I went up to be in Berkeley and spend some time with her. And I was like, okay, I got to get a job, and I'd already gotten into business school at that point, right? So I knew that I couldn't get like a real job, and I built this company that was still running, but I was like, oh man, being a bike messenger would be cool. This is to back like late 90s. This is the era of like, the Real World and Puck and like all this like, so I was like, okay, I can definitely do this. So it turns out that the worst possible city to be a new bike messenger in is San Francisco, because there's so many hills, right? And there's so much traffic. And the bike messengers were nuts. They would just like weave in and out of the cars, and they would like sort of prided themselves on all these risks they were taking. And so so on my first day, they gave me some things to do, and I can't remember. I don't think we used cell phones. I think it was beepers. I think they would give you a beeper, and that's how they told you where to go do your pickups. So I did like 4 or 5 pickups, and then I get this pickup, and it's at the top of this crazy big hill. Now, I didn't know this because I didn't know San Francisco well enough. There was actually a much easier way to get to the top of this hill, but I just started riding up the hill. And as I'm riding up, and it's so painful, I'm like, oh my God, this must be some like prank that they pull. I bet you I'm going to get up there and they're going to have like a beer waiting for me or something like that. I pedal and I pedal and I pedal and I pedal. I get to the top of the hill and I knock on the door, and the dude opens the door and he's like, hey, yeah, what took you so long? Here's the package. And I was like, oh, this is no prank. This just sucks. so and then went home and started coughing, and it turns out I got pneumonia. I got pneumonia from that one day of being a bike messenger. And I was like, okay, that's all I need.
Oh, I love it, man. And towards the end of Supercommunicators, your latest book, so well written, amazing stories, and then weaving the science and the practical application. It's just not surprising. I've read your other books that have crushed as well. You talk about the spring of 1937. A guy named Billy Grant wants to have a conversation and has a proposition for the people at Harvard and wants to give them some money. And there's a longer story there, but I sense that, and I've had Mark Schultz on, who is a part of this study right now with Dr. Robert Waldinger, so I'm very aware of it and it's useful. But it seems like that study played a big role in your life and why you wanted to write this book and why it's important for us to strive to be better communicators. Can you talk a little bit more about that study and about your life and struggles, and to why you wanted to take on this big project?
So this was originally known as the Grant Study. Now it's known as the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And the basic idea at first was to try and follow a group of Harvard men throughout their lives. And that in subsequent years, that was expanded to not just Harvard men, but families of the Harvard graduates. They chose a sample size from South Boston who were less privileged and less affluent than the original participants, for comparison's sake. And the basic thing that they wanted to figure out is, what are the determinants that when you reach sort of your senior years determine whether you are healthy, right? That you live longer than your peers, whether you're happy, and whether you're successful, however you might define success. And they had all kinds of crazy theories, right? This is like 80 years ago. So like they thought that, if you went to an Ivy League school, you'd probably end up healthier and happier. If you were born to a good family or a prominent family, you'd probably be healthy or happy. And it turns out none of those really panned out. There was basically only one thing that they found ended up determining if somebody was healthy, happy, and successful at age 65. And that's having at least a handful of close relationships at age 45. This U.S. Surgeon General has said that being lonely is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And 15 cigarettes a day is a lot of cigarettes, right? And I think it gets to what the researchers also found, which is, because we are social creatures, because humans need companionship, desire connection with others, it's very hard for us to be happy unless we have close relationships with at least a handful of other people. And if we're not happy, we're often going to be less healthy. Equally, having those relationships is really important for success because oftentimes you get exposed to opportunities you might not have seen otherwise because you know someone who clues you into something. And so, one of the big takeaways from this is that one of the most important things we can do with our life is seek to connect with other people. And the way that we connect with other people is usually through conversations, right? It's usually through understanding how to communicate, how to bond with someone, how to connect with them. It's calling someone, even if you don't see them, except for, once a year or once every year and a half, setting aside 2 hours to have a phone call with them because that's how you get caught up. That's how you get reconnected. Those things are really, really important. And we tend not to talk about them as much as we talk about other aspects of success in contemporary life. But this is the most important thing you can do for success.
I may mispronounce his name, but I loved reading about him. Felix Sagala, I believe. And what made him such an effective communicator?
Well, so and Felix Sagala, I should say, is a pseudonym because he asked me not to use his real name.
Oh, okay.
So Felix is a guy who he was in the military and then he goes to work for the FBI. And his bosses at the FBI noticed really quickly he's really good at like interpersonal stuff. He's really good at talking to people. He's really good at taking witnesses and making them comfortable and at ease. And so they basically start promoting him as like this good talker. And eventually he becomes known as this fix-it guy for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, right? He's the guy who would be sent in when there's a witness that's really resistant and you need to sort of help them understand how they're going to help the case. Or in really, really tough negotiations, they would send him in. Like there was this animal smuggling ring where he basically convinced the guy to give himself up and give up all the animals that were in his house and give up the rest of the ring by like getting him to think about this all from the snake's perspective. Like, what's it like for the snake? And the guy was like, I love snakes. I'd never do anything to hurt them. He ends up giving up everyone. And so when the Department of Defense had this, the Department of Defense wanted to figure out how to teach military officers, how to communicate better. And so they hired a bunch of academics and asked them to research the topic. And a bunch of people had suggested to them, you should go talk to Felix. So eventually they set up a meeting with Felix and they anticipate before he walks into the room that he's going to be like this, like, good looking, handsome, charismatic guy who like everyone loves, is really, really outgoing. And the guy who walks in basically looks like a middle-aged dad, right? He's got this like kind of like mousy mustache. He's like, 20, 25 pounds overweight. He's wearing like this like kind of ugly sweater. And so the researchers are like, why did everyone recommend we talk to you? Like, what do you do that's so special? And he was like, well, let me demonstrate it for you. And he starts asking them questions, right? And he asks them sort of what are known as deep questions, but to all the researchers, they didn't realize that he would ask questions like, what's one of your most precious memories? Or, what's something that helps me understand who you are? How did you decide to become a researcher? What made you decide to go into a PhD program? And as people would say things, he would often share things about himself. One person talked about one of his favorite memories was his sister's wedding because it was the last time that he and all of his siblings were together with their mom before their mom passed away. And Felix kind of asked a couple of questions and he he sort of empathized with the guy. And then he said, I totally understand what you're talking about because my sister, 2 years after she got married, she actually died of cancer. And I think about how beautiful she was on that day all the time. That's how I remember her. And they kind of did this for 45 minutes. And at the end of the conversation, people just felt wonderful, right? They just liked Felix. But they still said to him, like, we don't understand what you're doing. It just seems like you're having a pleasant conversation with us. And what Felix says is, well, if you pay attention to what's going on, what I'm doing is I'm asking you a certain kind of question, a deep question. I'm proving to you that I'm listening by asking follow-up questions or repeating back what you've said. When you say something vulnerable, I'm replying with my own vulnerability. When you say something emotional, I'm matching your emotionality. Or when you say something practical, I'm matching your practicality. We are all of us doing things, and because there's a social instinct, you are doing those things back to me. And as a result, we're creating this atmosphere of trust among all of us. And that's how we say things that feel revelatory and how we hear each other and feel connected. And that's kind of at the core of what Supercommunicators is about, right? That when I started writing this book, I assumed that supercommunicators would be people who were extroverts or, really charming. And it turns out that's not really true at all. And in fact, what the data tells us is that supercommunicators are distributed through the population in a kind of normal curve, that some of them are extroverts and some of them are introverts and some of them are charming and some of them are curmudgeonly. And that's because communication is just a set of skills. It's a set of skills that anyone can learn. And when we practice them, they become habits very quickly. And super communicators are just people who have thought a little bit more deeply about communication, about those skills, about practicing them. And the truth is, anyone can become a super communicator. Any of us can learn to connect with anyone.
Why are we not more naturally better at this?
I mean, we're actually fantastic at it, right? You probably have a conversation at least once a day with someone you haven't met before, and you do a really good job of it, right? You walk into your coffee shop and you order some coffee, and you don't say something to offend the barista, and maybe you guys even chat about the weather or how each other's day is going. So we're really, really good at communication, and in fact, that's a product of evolution. If you think about it, communication is Homo sapiens' superpower. Right? Communication is the thing that sets us apart from every other species and has allowed us to build families and villages and countries and to be able to transmit knowledge to each other without having to experience the learning of that knowledge and the hardship that entails. And so our brains have evolved to be very, very good at communication and to crave connecting with others, to crave meaningful dialogues. Now, that being said, sometimes this capacity fails us when it's most important to us, right? We get nervous. We're at a party and we don't know how to make small talk. We really want to impress someone and we don't know what to say. There's someone in our life, a boss that we want to connect with and have a deeper relationship with, and we're not certain how to do it. In those moments, what's usually happening is that we actually know some skills. There's skills that we use with our friends, with our family members, but we haven't thought about them as skills. We haven't reminded ourselves that they're skills that can be used in any setting. And most importantly, they're not habits, right? And so one of the things about our brain is that our brain is designed to take these skills, these tools, and Supercommunicators is just sort of an explanation of those different skills. And our brain is designed to make them into habits very quickly when we practice them. And so that's one of the things that I try and do with the book is I try and give very, very practical advice on here's a skill that you can use in this setting. Ask a deep question. Prove you're listening. There's this thing called looping for understanding. Each of these skills are things that if you practice them a little bit, they'll become a habit. And then in those moments when you do want to connect with someone, when it feels important to you to do so, you have the tools available to you to do it.
The kind of surface level conversation though with a barista about the weather, that doesn't feel like super communication because there's no depth, right? There's usually not a follow-up. There's just kind of a surface level conversation about something that doesn't really matter because the weather doesn't really matter that much. And then you're out the door. And so that to me doesn't feel like an example of being a super communicator. That's what most people do on a daily basis. A super communicator, to me at least, and you wrote it, not me, so correct me if I'm wrong, is standing on the sideline with another dad at your kid's soccer game and actually going into depth and listening and asking follow-up questions and getting to know them as a person and understanding how they feel, right? Which some would say, that seems crazy or awkward. To me, sounds very interesting, and it's actually what I do. Now, I think this podcast helps me get the repetitions to do that. But so that seems like a big difference between the barista surface level versus
the barista situation. I mean, but the issue there is time constraint, right?
Sure.
It's not that you don't have the ability, that there's like something about this barista that you couldn't possibly break through to.
Yeah.
If that barista if you had to stand next to that barista for 15 or 20 minutes, You could certainly have a deeper conversation with them. And on the sidelines, it's a lot easier because you're just standing there for 15 or 20 minutes, right? And
Yeah.
but the difference there is a difference of intent and of duration.
Mm-hmm.
But the same principles apply. And often, honestly, and if the coffee shop isn't busy, if you're not in a hurry, if it's not like they're trying to make, 4 different orders at once, but there's sort of some time, try asking that barista a deep question.
Yep.
Ask them hey, do you like working here? What's it like? Do you enjoy this job? And what you're going to find is that they probably do say something meaningful, right? They probably do connect with you a little bit. And again, you don't have the 15 or 20 minutes, and some of relationships is a product of time as opposed to what we do at that time. But yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I cut you off as poor listening, but I am curious. You're at a cocktail party or whatever, you're getting together with people that you don't know that well, and some introverted people don't enjoy those. However, you can have deep conversations. What are some other examples of deep questions you could ask someone? Let's get very practical. You could ask somebody at an event like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a deep question has a very specific definition. It's something that asks about your values or your beliefs or your experiences. And that can sound intimidating, but it's actually as simple as if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of saying, "Oh, where do you practice medicine?" asking them, "Oh, what made you decide to go to medical school?"
Yeah.
Right? Or do you like being a doctor? What do you love about your job?
Mm.
Right? Those are deep questions, because what I'm doing is I'm inviting that person to tell me something meaningful about who they are. Or let's take the party example that you just mentioned, right? Which is the easiest thing on earth to do. The most inevitable question that always comes up if you meet someone new at a party is, "Oh, where do you live? Like, what part of town do you live in?" "Oh, I live in Bernal Heights." "Oh, yeah." Now, the next thing you could say is "Oh, is that a good commute, a bad commute?" But if you were to say "Oh, do you like Bernal Heights? What made you decide to move there? What do you love about it?" Then you're asking this person to tell you all about what they think about community and what they think about their job and their commute. In many ways, a deep question is, instead of asking people about the facts of their life, asking them how they feel about their life.
Mm.
And this is very, very easy to do. There's a researcher named Nicholas Epley, who's at the University of Chicago, who does this experiment ever so often with himself. He sort of, where he'll get on a bus and he'll sit down next to a stranger, and his goal is to get to someone's hopes and dreams within 3 questions. And usually it only takes 2, because he'll sit down next to someone and he'll say "Oh, how you doing? What do you do for a living?" And the person will say, "I'm an accountant." And Nick will say, "Oh, did you always want to be an accountant? Was that like your dream job since you were a kid?" And the person will say something like, "No kid has dreams of being an accountant. Of course not. I wanted to be an astronaut." Right. And I actually applied to work at NASA and I got rejected. And so my dad was an accountant. I decided to follow in his footsteps. Now, suddenly I'm learning all about this person. I've invited them to tell me who they really are, how they see the world. And that's the basis for a real connection.
Mm. Speaking of astronauts, you studied NASA and the importance of emotional intelligence, that when I think it was President Reagan talked about the space station and staying there for 6+ months, these astronauts needed to have additional skills, one of them being emotional intelligence. What did the leaders at NASA learn about emotional intelligence from listening to how people laughed?
Yeah. So one of the things that they were working on is they needed to find people who had actual emotional intelligence rather than candidates who could fake it really well, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that happens is, if you make it to the final rounds of a NASA interview, you're really good, right? You're handsome, you have a PhD, you're a fighter pilot, but most importantly, you've done dozens and dozens of interviews in your lifetime. You're really good at answering questions. You know exactly what to say when they say "What's your biggest weakness? What's the thing you need to work on?" And so what they found is that most of the candidates in that final stage could fake emotional intelligence really, really well. And the problem, though, is that in a 6-month or 12-month mission in space, faking emotional intelligence will work for a week or two, But then at some point, if you're just faking emotional intelligence, things start breaking down. People get into fights with each other. You're in this tin can surrounded by vacuum. You're living next to your coworkers 24 hours a day. And they'd had a couple of instances where things had gone really awry because they had astronauts that did not have enough emotional intelligence. But the problem for NASA is they got to try and figure out, how do we test for this, right? How do we interview for this quality, because people can fake it so well? And this one guy comes up with an answer. He's the lead psychiatrist for manned spaceflight at NASA. And as he's listening to old recordings of astronaut candidates, he notices that the ones who went on to have really strong careers and be really strong leaders, they tended to laugh differently during interviews than everyone else. So he comes up with this new test. Now he walks into the interview room, and he's carrying a big stack of papers. And as he walks in, he drops the papers as if on accident. And this is a little bit embarrassing, right? If you're walking into a room, you drop a big stack of papers. And then to compound the embarrassment, he laughs in this kind of inappropriate way. He goes like, big boisterous laugh. I'm such a klutz. I can't believe I did that. Right. And we've all had that moment. We've all had that moment when we do something embarrassing and then we make it even worse by overreacting to the embarrassment. Right. Mm-hmm. But he's doing it on purpose. And he's doing it so that he can notice how the candidate reacts. And what he finds is that some candidates, everyone laughs in response, right? Because that's just social politeness. Some candidates laugh like this. They kind of chuckle. They go, that's really silly. Let me give you a hand with that. And some candidates match his boisterousness. And they go, that's really silly. Let me give you a hand with that. The ones who matched his boisterousness, what they're trying to do is they're trying to sort of signal, it's okay that you dropped these papers. It's okay that you just did this big laugh. You might feel embarrassed about it, but I'm going to get there with you. I'm going to stand right next to you so that you don't feel embarrassed, so that you feel okay. The ones who matched him were the ones with emotional intelligence. And this gets to a basic principle of what we know about communication. It's known as the matching principle within psychology, which is that oftentimes we have to be having the same kind of conversation at the same moment in order to really hear each other. And most conversations that we have, they fall into one of three buckets. There are practical discussions, right, where we're talking about plans or we're solving problems together. But then there's emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and how we relate to society, the social identities that are important to us. What we've found is that all three of those kinds of conversations are totally legitimate. And all three of them will probably happen during a discussion. But if you and I aren't having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, it's not going to work. If I come home from work and I've had a really rough day and I start complaining to my wife and I'm in an emotional mindset and she says, oh, here's some advice. Why don't you just take your boss out to lunch and get to know him a little bit better? I'm going to be able to hear what she's saying. In fact, I'm going to get even more upset and I'm going to accuse her of not taking my side and not supporting me. And she's going to get upset because I'm attacking her for giving me good advice. If you're having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, then you can move between those conversations together. And that's when you can really hear each other.
How does your wife know what kind of conversation you want to have, though?
Oftentimes she just asks me. Now that we've learned this, she'll just say, yeah, I'll come home and I'll complain. And she'll say, hey, do you want me to help you figure out a solution to this? Or do you just need to vent? Or you just need to get this off your chest? Really? Right. And I'll say, oh, it's not a big deal. I just need to get it off my chest. It's like, I'm upset right now, but I won't be upset 5 minutes from now. In fact, they teach teachers to do this in schools. In schools, when a student comes up and there's something important they want to talk about, the teacher is instructed to ask them right off the top, okay, so for this thing you want to talk to me about, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be heard? Or do you want to be hugged? Right? And those are the three kinds of conversations, the social, the emotional, and the practical. And the reason why that's so helpful is because then the student tells you what they want.
Yeah. I'm just curious, if I vented, which obviously I do, to my wife, she does to me too. I probably do it more than she does now I think about it. If I vented to her and she responded, do you want me to help you with the solution or you just want to vent? I might get more mad. I don't know. I may feel like that's a little patronizing. Am I off here, or have you seen any of the studies and the research where I guess the tone and the intent is probably more it's more
I
important
think, yeah. I mean, if she says like, do you want a solution or are you just venting? Right. Then you're like, but if she's showing you that she wants to connect, I mean, this is what super communicators do really well, is the reason why asking deep questions is important. The reason why proving we're listening is important. The reason why matching is important is because it's showing someone that we want to connect with them. If she said to you, oh man, that sounds really hard. Like, do you want me to think through some solutions with you? Or is this just something you just got to get it off your chest?
Yeah.
Okay. You would probably say like, oh, I just got to get it off my chest. Right. Or actually, and let's say you did say that. Let's say, no, I just need to complain about it. And you complain and she empathizes for a couple of minutes. Then probably she could say something like, hey, is it okay if we like think through some solutions to this?
Yeah.
And you guys will move together into a practical conversation, into a practical mindset.
Yeah.
I to be honest with you, I am guessing that your wife already does this and that you do it without even clocking that that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like, I'm certain that there are times that you ask questions and you might not be as explicit as saying, is this emotional or is this practical?
Yeah.
But you're asking, well, how can I help you? What do you need from me out of this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that never feels bad, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just showing my love language is curiosity. So I think showing genuine curiosity is a way to show love. I practice it. I try to practice this most days by recording a podcast with people and asking questions and being genuinely curious about them, their life, as well as their subject matter expertise. And try to do the same thing in relationships. One thing that I want to touch on, though, Charles, with the matching principle.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see any of the research, or have you seen examples where people fake that, where they match, but it's not authentic? It's like they know about this principle. And like, yeah, I grew up working in sales for more than a decade, and technically we're all in sales every day. We're selling something, ideas, or if you have a quota at a company, yes, you got to sell a product. But like, this is taught in sales, right? Is to match, is to be there. And so sometimes I've seen it used as a tool in a non-authentic way. And so when the person laughs and matches exactly, and matching can be used in other ways, like, how do we be careful with the line of that being genuine and authentic versus the person who understands it's a tool and uses it in a nefarious way?
Yeah. So, and there's an important distinction between matching and mimicry, right?
Okay.
Mimicry feels very artificial.
Yes.
Now, one thing that's interesting is so if you think about like how our brains evolved in a state of nature eons ago, if someone came to town and they were inauthentic, they were very, very dangerous. If I trust someone and they're not trustworthy, it can easily end up with me getting killed. And so as a result, our brains have evolved this capacity, sort of a hair trigger reaction to detecting inauthenticity. We're very, very good at it, right? We've all been at that party and somebody asks us where we went on vacation, and we realize pretty quickly they don't care where we went on vacation. They just want to tell us where they went on vacation. So we're impressed by the yacht that they stayed on.
Yep.
So what's really interesting is, you're right, in sales, in low stress situations or low commitment situations, yeah, you go and you buy a car and you just kind of assume that the salesman's going to be like a little Weasley, right? And try and match you.
Yeah.
But for things that matter, for real conversations, if somebody is just mimicking me, if it's not authentic, I'm going to pick up on it pretty quickly and I'm not going to trust them. And so the way that we overcome that is, instead of thinking about matching as mimicry, you said one thing, so I'm going to say something similar. Rather, it's trying to show the person you really want to connect with them. So that can sometimes mean that, for instance, if you tell me that, your aunt passed away, rather than me telling you about someone who passed away in my life, simply saying, I'm so sorry, I know how hard that is. Like, tell me about your aunt, or tell me how you're feeling, or tell me what's going on. Right? That is matching, because you've brought up something that's intimate and personal and emotional, and I'm showing you that I want to empathize. Matching, again, is not mimicry. When we mimic, it tends to turn people off. When we authentically match by trying to say, how does this person see the world? How can I see the world and share with them something that seems to align with what they're looking for?
Hmm.
That tends to work. And it's very hard to fake that.
Yeah. You got to hang out and talk with the writers from the Big Bang Theory. Young Sheldon and Big Bang Theory is special to my family because it's one of the few shows we actually watch as a family, especially Young Sheldon, but they go together. I'm curious, what did you learn about being a super communicator from the writers from the Big Bang Theory?
So one of the big problems that they confronted was their characters are the very nature of their characters is that they're awkward, right?
Yeah.
They're very bad at expressing emotions. They're very bad at saying things appropriately. They in theory are very practical minded, although in truth they really aren't. And so one of the hard things for a sitcom is that in a sitcom, one of the biggest duties that you have as a writer is to help the audience know exactly what someone is thinking and feeling as soon as they walk on the screen. A sitcom is so fast moving, there's really no room for ambiguity. So as soon as two people are on a screen, you have to know if they like each other or if they hate each other or if they're pretending to hate each other because they're really in love with each other, right? We've all seen that before. And the question is, how do you do that with characters that are very, very bad at expressing themselves? And they went through a bunch of different solutions. And actually, the first time they made a pilot for the Big Bang Theory, it was a total flop. Like the show almost like ceased to exist because they'd done such a poor job of writing these characters and writing the show. But they decided to take one more stab at it. And what they realize is that we can show that whether these characters like each other and they're connecting with each other or not necessarily based on what they're saying, but based on the energy and the mood that they're transmitting to the other person. So if somebody comes into a room and they say, "I'm so angry," and the other person comes in and they say, "I understand what you mean. I'm really happy, but I understand that you're angry." Because their energy and their moods are matching, you see these people as aligned. You know that they're connecting with each other. And so this became the solution. If you watch Big Bang Theory or you watch Young Sheldon, what you'll notice is that irrespective of what the line that they're saying is, they are saying it in such a way to show you either they feel connected to each other or they don't feel connected to each other. And the things you can look for are like the pace of their voice. How quickly are they talking? The energy. Are they showing that they're, positive mood or negative mood? Two people can come on and both be low energy and negative mood, and you know that they're connecting with each other because they are exhibiting the same behavior, even if they're saying very different things.
Gotcha. I love it. I appreciate, again, the way you weave stories in so well, because this is like a way I think people try to write and struggle with, and it's one way that you really mastered it. Charles, tried to have learning conversations every day. I feel very lucky and am very grateful to be able to have learning conversations every day. A lot of them are recorded, some of them are not. Can you share more about what a learning conversation is, as well as the 4 rules of a learning conversation?
Yeah. So a learning conversation is just a conversation where you acknowledge, and this is true of every conversation, that your goal in this conversation is simply to understand what the other person is trying to tell you and to speak in such a way that they can understand you, right? It's not to convince them that you're right and they're wrong. It's not to impress them. It's not to get them to like you or to think you're smart. It's literally just to understand what they're saying and then speak in such a way that they can understand you. And there are these 4 rules, and they can be a little bit clunky because it's a way in the book for sort of organizing the knowledge, but people don't have to remember 4 rules when they're talking. And they're basically, try and figure out what kind of conversation you're having. Is it emotional? Is it social? Is it practical? Try and figure out like what people want from this conversation, right? And including yourself, like before you open your mouth or you pick up the phone, ask yourself, like, why am I doing this? What do I actually hope to get out of this? And most importantly, can I ask the other person what they want to get out of this? Like, is there a graceful way to figure out why they're talking to me in return? The third thing is to remember that emotions are part of every single conversation. even though they're very easy to overlook. You know, sometimes we're having a practical conversation and we're talking about the budget. We think there's no emotional element to it, but emotions are already shaping how I hear things and how I speak. And the truth of the matter is, if we're talking about the budget, there's might be a part of my brain that's anxious because if we don't get this budget right, I'm going to have to lay off some of my people, and that's making me really, really uncomfortable. And and we can pretend that those emotions don't exist, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And the much healthier thing to do is to just simply acknowledge that they do exist and try and take them off the table by recognizing them. And then finally, the thing that we can do in some conversations is just figure out, our social identity is important to this conversation, right? In the conversation you and I are having right now, social identities are probably less important than if we were talking about politics or if we were talking about race or we were talking about other topics. But at the same time, social identities can influence. You know, I mentioned I grew up in New Mexico, and there's probably a number of things that you know or think you know about New Mexico, and that shapes a little bit how you see me. You know, I have 9 siblings, for instance. When I say that to people, oftentimes it shapes how they see me. And similarly, I make inferences about you, but understanding your social identities, which identities are important to you, whether it's important that where you live or where you went to school or the church you attend or how you identify yourself as a part of society, that might influence this conversation quite a bit, and it might not. But just being aware of that possibility makes it easier for us to connect.
I really love the idea of approaching people with genuine curiosity and fascination about them and their story, and approaching them to trying to have a learning conversation, as opposed to just kind of wandering through life without as much purpose and intention. And you don't have to become robotic at all. I mean, I would highly, highly recommend people read Supercommunicators. It's one of the few books. I read a ton of books for this podcast, Charles. It's one of the few ones that I've had a day-long conversation with my wife via text and in person saying, we're both going to read this together.
Oh, that's wonderful.
We're reading this together because I think it will help us as parents. It'll help us in our relationship. It'll help us in so many different ways. And I'm like, it's actually really entertaining too, in addition to being super useful and really good. So
that's really kind of you.
I think if we approach people with genuine fascination and curiosity to have deep questions, you may be surprised. You may be surprised at what happens, pleasantly surprised that people want to go there. They want to do it. I felt this. And your work backs this up. So I know we got to run, but the book is called Supercommunicators: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. It's really good. Highly recommend it. Charles, thank you so much for being here. And I would love to continue our dialogue as we both progress, man.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and have a great day.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Take care.